Hey there, fellow netizens. This is Kevin in the editor's chair with another brief content warning like we did with our last episode. As we talked about in our last episode, this one on Dungeons & Dragons is going to involve some brief discussion of mental health issues as well as suicide and suicidal ideation. I'll include timestamps in the description if you want to skip past those parts, as well as some resources. If you or someone you know is grappling and needs help, remember, you are not alone. And with that, let's get to the show.
I failed the persuasion check. That's why I never got a date. Hello, fellow netizens, and welcome to Scandalous Games, the show where we take a closer look at video game-related controversies. I'm Kevin Impellizzeri, and I do the research and share a story of a video game-related controversy to my friends.
I'm Kate Lynch. I've been writing software for over 10 years, but not the fun kind.
Hey, I'm Andy Hunter, a longtime fan of all things Nintendo and D&D.
Hi, I'm Matt Shoemaker, author of Gathering of Gamers.
And welcome back, everybody, as we continue our deep dive into Dungeons & Dragons with the help of Matt Shoemaker, recently published author of Gathering of Gamers, Dungeons & Dragons and Other Games Through Gen Con, published through Place Story Press. And last time, we got an introduction to Gen Con, the largest tabletop gaming convention in the world, its interconnectedness with Dungeons & Dragons, of course, the famous tabletop fantasy role-playing game. And then we led into talking about some of the moral anxiety that developed over Dungeons & Dragons in the late 1970s into the 1980s, particularly the 1979 disappearance of James Dallas Egbert III, a troubled college student from Michigan State University, and the colorful private investigator William Deere, who tried to track him down, convinced that he was a player in Dallas's elaborate D&D campaign. And all this has been prelude to the real topic of this episode, which is Patricia Pat Pulling. I'm sure you've come across Pat, Matt.
Oh, yes, of course. How can one not if you study Dungeons & Dragons? Or the 1980s even. I mean, really.
I don't know if you're familiar with the name Pat Pulling, Andy.
No, it doesn't ring a bell.
All right, here we go. This is kind of the real meat of this whole thing, is talking about Pat Pulling and her crusade against D&D. So why don't we just dive right into it? So Pat Pulling was born Patricia Ann Shoker in Virginia on June the 30th, 1948. I'm not going to talk about the early life of Pat Pulling because it's not terribly interesting here, but the most important thing is getting into the summer of 1982. At the time, she was married to Irving Pulling, who went by Lee, and the pair lived in Montpelier, Virginia, which is a suburb of Richmond, with their two children, 9-year-old Melissa and 16-year-old Irving Jr., who went by Bink. Pulling described Bink as an intelligent young man who was enrolled in the Talented and Gifted program at Patrick Henry High School in nearby Ashland. On June the 9th, 1982, another content warning for brief talk of suicide here. On June the 9th, 1982, Pat and Lee went out on a shopping trip, leaving Bink home alone. According to Pat, they bought a boombox and tickets to Disney World as a reward for Bink finishing his junior year with good grades. Then they picked up Melissa, who was staying at a relative's house, and headed home. When the family arrived that evening, they found Bink dead on the front lawn from what they later learned was a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the chest. The sudden, shocking death of her son had an understandably profound impact on Pulling. As she recalled in her 1989 book, The Devil's Web, which, believe you me, we're going to talk a bit about this book. As she said in her book, quote, "I had never known that a person could hurt that bad and not die from it," end quote. So Pat, coming from a very, very tragic thing with the sudden, very dramatic death of her son. And according to Pat, following Bink's death, an investigator from the Hanover County Sheriff's Office asked her a totally normal, healthy question, inquiring, quote, "Mrs. Pulling, are you and your husband devil worshippers?" That's a normal thing to say.
Wait, I'm sorry, who asked her this?
So this is a police officer investigating Bink's death. Comes up to Pat and asks her if she and her husband worship the devil.
Was this like at the site, like at the scene of the crime? Was this, I mean, like not crime, you know what I mean? Like, was it like when they responded to the call, or?
It was sometime after it. But yes, eventually it's just asked, are you
So
a
eventually
Satan
somebody asks her.
Yes.
Okay.
A cop asked her if she worshipped
So
the devil.
you conjured this image for me. That was horrifying.
And I just want to add this, this happened. I mentioned there's other, made-for-TV movies, made-for-TV shows and stuff about these suicides, murders. This was a common thing that happened after the Egbert case, because when they started pushing D&D as being satanistic or being part of cults and things like that, law enforcement took it seriously, even though maybe they shouldn't have, because it wasn't grounded in reality. So there were legit police departments going around asking people these kinds of questions when they were dealing with, murders or suicides that involved, teenagers. This happened. I couldn't tell you exactly how many times, but this is something I've come across multiple times.
Yeah, and on top of that, it wasn't just that police officers were asking these kinds of questions because they've developed, skipping ahead, a whole cottage industry of, later on, skipping ahead, Pat Pulling was one of, who were basically these kind of self-proclaimed occult experts who would talk, not primarily, but very much so with law enforcement, and say, here are the things you need to look for, and then turn to inquire whether or not tabletop role playing or other kind of vague, allegedly occult things were going on. And we'll talk a little bit about how vague that could get. But yeah, so this person asked Pat and her husband, "Are you devil worshippers?" And Pat has a very understandable response. He was like, "What the fuck? Why are we saying this thing? This is not exactly a normal thing to hear." Whereupon the officer handed Pat her son's suicide note. In the pages of the Devil's Web, Pat shared the details of Bink's note. She does not quote it verbatim, but she does share these details, and I'm quoting from Pat. Quote, "It began, 'Dear Mom and Dad,' and went on to describe how evil he thought he had become. He equated himself with Adolf Hitler and the Antichrist, and said that he had been summoned to commit murder, couldn't bring himself to hurt anyone else, and so must end his life to rid the world of his evil. He hoped we would understand and told us not to worry about him. He even said that I would have another child within a year and that the child would be a boy. He asked that we cremate his body and scattered the ashes. It was signed Love Bink," end quote. Any thoughts on this so far?
That's really sad. It speaks to a lot of struggling that he was doing at the time. To be a kid who could write that about yourself and leave that to your family thinking that that's going to make them better. It's just really sad.
Yeah, it's yeah, I mean, I'm not a therapist or a medical health expert. It sounds to me like, was he experiencing schizophrenia or something? Was he hearing hallucinations that were, he thought were like guiding him to do bad things that he felt like he would have trouble resisting if he didn't, take such drastic action. But yeah, it is a real shame, and it's a shame he didn't talk to anybody about it before this point.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit later about the contested idea about what was Bink Pulling going through. That's going to be a future episode in this series we talk about. But
I mean, to me, I hear when I hear that note, I hear somebody who's in tremendous pain and who needs help and may or may not have had any way of finding help. I do not immediately think Satan worshiper or anything like that. If that's your question, Kevin.
Yeah. It's incredibly troubling. If I were to lighten the mood a little bit, the angle that Pat Pulling takes on this is Satan worship. That's where this goes. That's where this leads to. This does not lead to a serious conversation about mental health. It does not lead to a conversation about guns. It leads down the road toward the occult. That's where this leads to. So yeah, with all that percolating in her brain, Pat set to work piecing together what might have caused her son's death. According to Pulling, Bink had left a stack of books on the kitchen table he had brought home from school after cleaning out his locker. It was the end of the school year, so he cleans out his locker, he's got a stack of these books. Along with what she described as, quote, violent, sadistic poems, end quote, Pat noticed among the stack 2 advanced Dungeons & Dragons books, the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual, so 2 of the 3 books of the core rulebook of Dungeons & Dragons. She also found a note, presumably from a fellow D&D player to Bink, that read, quote, "Your soul is mine. I choose the time. At my command, you will reave the land, a follower of evil, a killer of man," end quote. And thus the wheels began to turn, and she formulated a hypothesis. Did playing Dungeons & Dragons have some kind of corrupting influence on her son that would inspire such violent thoughts in him? And so, Matt, as a longtime DM, I'm sure you've put plenty of curse on an unsuspecting player.
Of course. Who hasn't? Yeah, everyone's been there. But yeah, I mean, there's weird things that get said, especially in teenage years. I mean, as I said when we were talking about our history of D&D, I play D&D a lot differently now in my 40s than I did when I was, 8 years old, or especially when I was a teenager. I mean, when you're a teenager playing Dungeons and Dragons, you're doing all kinds of crazy stuff. I mean, you're following like what you see in action movies. You're really harping up how evil stuff is. I mean, like, it's just easy to get lost in this stuff for sure. It doesn't mean you mean any of it or you take it seriously, but it's definitely an angle you take in these games for sure, especially D&D back in the 80s and 90s. I mean, like I said, I've been playing D&D a long time, not quite 40 years, but pretty close. And I mean, the game is very different now from then, but playing it in the 80s and 90s, reading old TSR modules and things like that, It was it's just it's a very I mean it's all tied up into all different aspects of society, mental health, how people think role playing is. I mean, TSR. I mean, it was the main game. D&D was the main game by far. So much so that when you look at like Gen Con, just give you an example here, like there might be 800 games of D&D at Gen Con on a weekend. The next highest game might be something like Cyberpunk or Call of Cthulhu, but it doesn't have hundreds of games. It doesn't have dozens of games. There might be like 8 Cyberpunk games having at Gen Con. So like D&D and its style of play and its writing style and these common attitudes that people had to it were a very common theme during this time.
And I mean, would it be also fair to like that slip of paper? I mean, that could have been two kids playing messing with each other. It could also have been something like, "Oh, you rolled. Here's the curse that your character gets," and like, "I, the GM, I'm going to write it on paper, and you get it. You read it to yourself, and you know what I mean. Like that could be laying. I mean, we could hypothesize everywhere, but to me, that could also just be almost like a game piece, right? Like,
Oh, for sure. That's sorry if that wasn't clear. That's kind of what I meant. Like that could just be a part of the game, a dungeon master giving a player a note that they're not meant to take seriously outside of the game. They're not supposed to take it seriously in the game. It's just like you said. It's just a part of playing the game.
Like it almost sounds like at some point the DM could just like give them the signal and go, "The thing I told you in that note. Now you have to do that sort of thing, or something like
Yeah, I
that."
mean it's a common thing that happens in role playing games for sure, forever, totally.
Yeah, and speaking of Gen Con, I remember doing a Call of Cthulhu one shot at Gen Con and having a DM pass me a message like that, where the idea is like under these specific circumstances, you roleplay like that's something that happens in these kinds of games. But Pat, who doesn't, skipping ahead, I have some doubts about her sincerity in this book, real doubts. But if we're to take this from a sincere level, like she has none of that context. She doesn't know what she's looking at. And she just had her son die, and she's trying to find meaning in whatever she finds. So if we're to take this from at the very least, an empathetic angle, that's where I would take it. But yeah, so she finds all this stuff, and so according to Pulling, her recollection is she never heard of D&D before finding these books. I mean, maybe they just never talked. And she never found his D&D stuff lying around. Because, the thing about teens is they're notoriously tidy. They always pick up after themselves. And parents famously never go through their kids' things unless after they're dead. But anyway, later at Big's funeral, Pulling claimed that she started asking about the game to Big's friends and teachers, alleging that they started getting really cagey and evading her questions, leading her to believe that there was some kind of conspiracy afoot. Writing in the Devil's Web, quote, "Whatever this game was, no one wanted to talk about it or would even admit to knowing anything about it," end quote. Thus, she resolved to get to the bottom of this Dungeons and Dragons business by inquiring about it at a local game shop. This is also a similar story that Deer says too, but anyway. However, it seems that she just couldn't wrap her head around the idea of a game where your only pieces are dice and an imagination, so she took her investigation one step forward, trolling a local college until she found some students holding D&D books and asked them to teach Pulling how to play. And according to Pat, these sessions occurred daily for several hours at a time for a whole month. I'm beginning to see holes in this story.
Yeah, that's pretty doubtful. I mean, don't get me wrong, teenage, college age me played a lot of D&D, but like
that would be the most consistent campaign.
yeah, I mean, yeah, you got a lot of free time when you're a teenager, less so as a college student. We still got a bunch of it, but yeah, not multiple hours a day every day for a month. Yeah, I don't know about that one.
Yeah, I mean, unless she found just like their D&D club and just like went, it was a club that met every day, and it wasn't the same 5 people who showed up every day necessarily, but no matter who was there, these college students were apparently happy to play with this woman old enough to be their mother.
Maybe one of them had a crush on her. I don't know.
Yeah, for context, Pat Pulling is at about her mid-30s at this point. Her walking around a random college campus, find some kids with D&D books. Why don't you let me back into your
multiple
dorm?
hours a day.
For a month.
Multiple hours a day, multiple days a week for a month. That is really strange.
So yeah, with all that in mind, this is where
Perhaps it's an exaggeration. I'm just throwing that out there.
Perhaps it is exaggeration. And this is where I get to say that cards on the table. On the whole, I do not believe that Patricia Pulling is a reliable or an honest source. And this is the first example of why you can never, ever, ever take her claims as your sole source on anything, because there is absolutely no fucking way this happened. There's no way this story happened the way she says it is. Like, anybody who's organized a D&D campaign knows it's hard enough to organize one dedicated night, even one dedicated night a month, let alone every single night for a month. There is no way this happened. And on the other hand, just based on what she says about D&D, I would be surprised if she ever played this game once, let alone every day for a month.
Now, see, that makes what you're about to say is probably make a lot more sense to me that she never played it. I mean, like, what we're talking about with the timing, it's like, that could be an exaggeration. Like, you could say, okay, well, she probably played a few times with some college students, and in her book said it was multiple hours for multiple days for multiple weeks in a month, something like that. Like, that I feel like what you're about to say next, if you're starting to throw out gameplay scenarios or rules that make no sense to people who play, then that's going to help me.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, like what her interpretations of D&D are in a second. But like, again, I don't have a lot to base this on except for some assumptions. It's very possible she stole an aspect of this story from William Deere, because William Deere does tell a story in The Dungeon Master about him meeting up with a guy at a gaming shop and him doing one, not a month, one shot with them. And it sounds like he actually played this game. It's fairly mundane. He has a lot of very specific details that are specific to D&D. I think William Deere played one session of D&D. I don't think Pat Pulling played any session of D&D, let alone a month of playing D&D. And the rest of what I'm charitably calling Pat's research into the hazardous effects of D&D involved a very selective and very literal reading of the D&D core rulebooks, drawing wild assertions of alleged D&D connections to various crimes, uncritically reporting the testimonies of confessed murderers serving life sentences on death row, and a very healthy dose of wild, unsubstantiated speculation, because as the great Lionel Hutz taught us, hearsay and conjecture are kinds of evidence. For example, one of her favorite sources was Darren Molitor, who was serving a life sentence for the March the 13th, 1984 murder of 18-year-old Mary Towie. During his 1985 trial, Molitor's lawyers argued for a lighter sentence on the grounds that he was desensitized to violence because he played too much D&D, an assertion the judges soundly rejected. You could probably interpret that as them trying to get a lighter sentence for a guy who had been convicted of murder. They're trying to save him from like lethal injection or whatever. Trying to say that something else was a mitigating factor in that.
Well, and to Matt's point, like D&D was such a thing that was pointed to by law enforcement, like that's it was D&D that made him do it. Like let's try to lessen the sentence as a result of that.
Yeah. And you see this later on with violent video games in terms of where a person has been convicted and they're facing a death penalty charge, and they're trying to get their sentence lightened by saying that there were these outside factors. That is actually really common in later cases too. It's also worth mentioning, who did Molitor's defense bring in to make such a claim that D&D caused this murder?
Jack Thompson.
Jack Thompson's a good guess.
Do I win a cookie if it's William Deere?
William Deere's a good guess.
It wouldn't have been Pat Pulling, would it?
To quote the title of a very, very problematic Saturday Night Live movie, it's Pat. Pat Pulling was the one who said that D&D caused this.
Wait, so she's saying evidence for D&D making people do violence is this murderer, but then also this murderer is saying evidence that D&D made me do this is Pat Pulling? They're each other's source?
It's a rhetorical snake eating its own tail. Pat Pulling was an expert witness on this case, trying to claim that D&D was the cause behind it. There was another guy, which we're going to talk about when we do our next episode on this, that was also involved. But this is after Pat Pulling becomes an activist. And yes, she is the one saying that this is happening and then citing it as evidence that D&D causes murders. Hey there, fellow netizens. This is Kevin in the editor's chair with a brief addendum to this section. So, Pat Pulling testified at Molitor's trial, arguing that Dungeons & Dragons contributed to the crime, helped desensitize him to violence, and so forth. However, Darren Molitor also made a statement about this. Molitor put out a letter on March the 22nd, 1985, in which he detailed his descent into violence and the occult through the gateway drug that was Dungeons & Dragons. However, I think it's important to take this account with a grain of salt, because this letter was widely distributed by a group called Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later in this episode, which, skipping ahead, was founded by Pat Pulling. So, what came first? Molitor saying that Dungeons and Dragons led him to murder Mary Towie, or that Patricia Pulling made the argument that Dungeons and Dragons caused the murder of Mary Towie, and now that he is embracing it, did she get the idea from him? Did he get the idea from her? I don't have a way of disentangling that. But what I will do is I will include a link to the letter, which is on a great site called The Escapist, not the video game Escapist, but a tabletop role-playing Escapist site, which focuses a lot on the panic over Dungeons and Dragons in the 80s. So just at least a little bit of more context for this part, and back to the show. So yeah, with that, what did Pat learn about D&D under this research? Her conclusions of the game are basically boiled down to 4 core arguments, which I'll present in escalating order of weirdness. Point number 1. Dungeons & Dragons have the power to psychologically condition its players, insidiously influencing their thoughts the more they played. She called this process behavior modification, arguing some players got so hooked in the game that they even felt compelled to make skill checks in real life. And as longtime D&D players, I know that I cannot go anywhere without rolling a d20 on it.
You imagine like being in line at the bank behind one of these folks?
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, back then it would have been percentile dice, I guess, right? So, like, oh man, I need to carry my 2d10s around anytime I want to ask a girl out on a date.
I failed the persuasion check. That's why I never got a date.
I mean, you're also going to have to carry your character sheet around the whole time, too.
There's that Futurama joke where Gary Gygax rolls the dice. It's a pleasure to meet you.
That was really Gary Gygax, I remember, in that episode, too.
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, in Pat's eyes, the game's influence was especially hazardous to brilliant young men like her son. Her sample size was basically her son, and she kind of worked backwards in terms of intellectual inquiry. But and she thought that really intelligent young men were, at one time, extremely intelligent and imaginative, while at the same point, extremely impressionable and susceptible to suggestion. That they're both brilliant, but they have no discernment whatsoever and will do whatever anybody tells them. Thus, for these players, persistent, protracted role-playing warped their minds to the point that they were incapable of distinguishing fantasy from reality. If their character committed evil deeds, then they had to commit them in real life. And if their character died, the damage to their psyche was so great that they had no choice but to die for real. According to Pulling, quote, once hooked on the game, a player's mind may accept the violent events without a second thought. When this begins to occur, negative behavior modification has taken place. Traditional values are pushed aside, and ethics become situational. Mind alteration has begun. The player's character becomes the player's alter ego, end quote. She also described the game as extremely addictive, drawing in players and hooking them body and soul. Speaking to a Chicago Tribune reporter in 1985, Pulling likened playing Dungeons & Dragons to shooting up heroin, explaining, quote, you do not casually play this game, just as you do not casually take heroin. This game captures youths totally. It stimulates their imaginations, all right, but it's imagination of killing and horror, end quote.
So if D&D is heroin, does that make, like, chess the gateway drug or something?
You need to ban that chess. To make matters worse, there's point number 2. Dungeons & Dragons was basically a cult, led by the charismatic and powerful Dungeon Master. To Pat, the DM was essentially God in the eyes of the players, a being who had the power of life and death in their hands, whom players needed to appease, lest they incur the DM's wrath. And if you want to see how badly this could potentially go in Pat's eyes, I refer you again back to point number 1. As with many real cults, DMing in the 80s was also apparently pretty lucrative, with Pulling claiming in The Devil's Web that she learned of at least one woman who, quote, left her career to be a full-time DM. She is supported entirely by her D&D players, end quote, which I feel can only be true if that woman also just happens to be Matt Mercer.
I do want to say there's a lot of people who are professional dungeon masters these days, but the number of them that can truly say they're making a living on it is pretty small, and a lot of them also happen to be things like YouTube personalities and influencers as well. There's a lot of people out there trying to make their way today, and D&D is at the height of its popularity. You know, they're lucky if they're making minimum wage doing it, for sure. And that's today. I don't know about the 80s.
Come on, how many covens have you had in your DMing career, Matt?
Yeah, I'd have to say none, but yeah, that's just me.
So speaking of cults, there's point number 3. Dungeons & Dragons is, in her words, quote, a complete how-to system, a basic primer on the occult, end quote. On the one hand, The game was loaded with occult elements, including magic, monsters, demons, and evil gods, thus easing players into accepting the idea that these demonic forces are real and should be served in the real world, because it's definitely how that works. On the other hand, she also maintained that there was, in fact, a vast network of Satanists operating right under our noses in the United States through an interconnected system of cults and covens dedicated to destroying traditional Christian values and causing murder and mayhem. And I will be the first to admit that we've kind of taken a long walk in this episode.
So are these covens and cults all perhaps in the basements of various pizzerias, do we think?
I'm not even going to make the joke to say baby QAnon was right. It was all in the dice. How did we not find out it was in the dice?
We failed our perception check, obviously.
There you go. Pat was certain you could see the influence of these murderous devil worshippers everywhere once you knew where to look. Graffiti, Satanists. Salacious heavy metal music, Satanists. Unsolved murders, Satanists. Kids using slang you don't understand, Satanists. She also claimed that some of these groups had allegedly been active for decades, warning of quote-unquote generational Satanists who were born and raised in the satanic covens to worship evil. I mean, I don't know, we've all come up through organized religions. I feel like if you did that, eventually it just becomes like a, call them holiday Christians kind of thing, holiday Satanists, you know. I know I'm stealing a joke from a Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman book by saying that. So yeah, it is worth mentioning that Pat wasn't, as I think you mentioned this a while back, Matt, like Pat wasn't alone in raising the alarms over Satan and his alleged legions of fans during this time. And her backlash to Dungeons and Dragons was one part of a larger system of demonic-inspired foo-for-rahs in the United States during the 1980s, collectively known as the Satanic Panic. These panics ran what I like to consider a silly to serious spectrum, with some incredibly weird, incredibly unhinged claims. For example, allegations that playing metal songs backwards revealed hidden satanic messages, or seeing supposed occult symbolism in the Procter & Gamble logo. And if you want a really, really fun time, check out the Dollop episode about that. I'll put a link in the description. However, on the other hand, there were also some really dark affairs that were related to this too, and probably the most notorious of these was the 1983 McMartin preschool scandal, in which law enforcement officials accused the proprietors of a Manhattan Beach, California daycare center of engaging in ritual child sexual abuse, which eventually led to the longest and most expensive trial in U.S. history, but crucially no convictions in what is generally considered a hysterical, unsubstantiated witch hunt. So this kind of ran the gamut, and Pat Pulling's concerns over the alleged impact of D&D kind of fits within this larger context. But going back to Pulling, Pat also noted that young people were especially susceptible to satanic grooming, lured into the world of sex, drugs, and violence through the siren songs of heavy metal music and the addictive appeal of rolling charisma checks. So then, what are the warning signs for parents to identify whether their kids are being seduced by the devil? I know a couple of us are parents here. These are the things you might want to keep an eye out for as your kids get a little older that might suggest that, you know, the devil might be involved. In The Devil's Web, Pulley explained that the most likely teens to be lured by demonic power were basically anyone who is exactly like her son Bink, highly intelligent white males from affluent backgrounds. However, she also noted that no child was safe from the alluring grasp of the dungeon master. Their victims could be boys or girls at any and all socioeconomic levels, overachievers or underachievers, loners or social butterflies, juvenile delinquents or well-behaved kids, drug users or not. All were within the DM's grasp. In short, in Pat's eyes, every teen is secretly a brain, and an athlete, and a basket case, a princess, and a criminal Satanist indoctrinated by Dungeons and Dragons. My entire script started with that joke. Please clap. I don't know.
Please clap. Clap, clap, clap.
By Pat's estimation, all the previous points were deadly ingredients in an even deadlier occult stew. Namely, playing Dungeons & Dragons leads to ritualistic violence, either as self-harm or suicide, or violent crimes such as assault and murder. Pulling viewed playing the game as a slippery slope that started with role-playing and dice throwing, and logically escalated in intensity until kids were indiscriminately killing themselves and others. As Pulling explained in The Devil's Web, quote, law enforcement officials and mental health professionals now recognize the fact that adolescent and cult involvement is progressive. The child who is obsessed with occult entertainment may stop there, but he often moves on to satanic graffiti and cemetery vandalism. From that point, he easily moves into grave robbing for items needed for occult rituals, and he's just a step away from bloodletting. Bloodletting begins with animal killings and mutilations and progresses to murder if intervention does not take place, end quote. So I ask you, Matt, how much cemetery vandalism and animal sacrifice was going on at Gen Con in the 80s?
I'm gonna go with 0.
We've all been on that deadly slide from the start of rolling for your character and ending in prison.
Yeah, I will say there were probably many, many jokes and people talking about that kind of stuff, but how much of it actually happened, I'm gonna stick with 0. So yeah.
Yeah, it's also so funny that because I think most people who actually do expose themselves to any D&D will come away thinking the opposite of it's Satanist because you can spend so much time in D&D killing undead and killing demons and killing devils, and there are multiple classes who get their power by worshiping good heavenly beings, you know? So it is, yeah, it's just very funny to me, like, well, listen, there's devilry at all, even if the point is to kill it. Thus, that means you're being susceptible to Satanism.
I know one of the things that Pulling fixated upon was character alignment. The idea that there was the existence of, lawful evil, chaotic evil was to her that, of course, characters are going to be chaotic evil and they're going to be, murdering and pillaging everything. And of course, because their character alignment says that, they must have to do that, even doing that in real life. I have played D&D enough, and I know a bunch of you have played longer than I never take the alignments that seriously. I don't know if it was different in the 80s, but
Yeah, I mean, it was different back then, but like even in a modern day, like, I mean, alignment is kind of like not even a thing anymore, really. Like it still technically exists, but like even to get away from some of this, for example, the Adventurers League, which I guess kind of doesn't exist anymore, but the Adventurers League, if you don't know, was the organized play arm for Dungeons and Dragons in the 2010s through the early 2020s, which basically means it was the official sanctioned way to play official adventures with people at stores and conventions and things like that. But even with that, like they made it so you couldn't play Adventures League with a character with evil alignment. Like they just didn't allow it because it was just causing too many problems. Because alignment, while it wasn't meant to necessarily show that if you're chaotic evil, you're a crazy nut job who's just going to murder a baby. Like I know that's what a lot of people think what that is, but that's not how the system was originally developed at all. But it's easy to misconstrue for sure.
yeah, I know. I had a very kind DM who let me do like a modify. I wanted to play a necromancer for like the longest time. And I did a 3.5 edition campaign for a while where I was his necromancer. Technically, necromancer should probably be some evil alignment. I basically just played as like lawful neutral, I think, was how I played it. Like I just wanted to have a guy who could resurrect undead characters because I thought that was fun. And like ultimately beyond that, beyond role playing, I didn't do anything with it. But I mean, that's a sample size of one, but but she was really obsessed with this idea of alignment as a measure of morality, basically. So yeah, tying back to Bink. What did all that mean for Bink Pulling all this, research that Pat did? According to Pat, the evidence was clear. Obviously, her son's death was the result of a satanic curse levied upon him during a session of Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, there's no way it could be anything else but that. Obviously a curse.
Yeah, like I don't want to make too much fun of this grieving mother, but it is sadly, it seems to be a trait that she shared with her son of not really being able to process effectively feelings that she was experiencing and finding an outlet that was maybe less healthy than talking to a therapist.
This does seem like she was searching for a reason, searching for an explanation for why he took his own life. And maybe it was the cop asking her, hey, were you Satan worshippers? No, why? Explaining that this was a possibility, given that this was something that police were interested in at the time. And she perhaps just took it and ran with it because she found a book and a game piece from a game he played. Maybe he played the game once, maybe he played it a bunch and she didn't know about it. It just seems like to me that this was her, obsessive, passion and attempt to process her grief over the sudden loss of her son.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. And it's like later on, we will talk about kind of like the other things that might have been going on with this. And It does kind of come down to the whole thing that some people will do anything but go to therapy. And this is Pat Pulling's story is kind of the epitome of that. So yeah, this curse. So in some tellings, she asserted that this was a death curse that placed in her son's head the murderous impulses that he could only escape by taking his own life. However, interestingly, in other tellings, Pulling claimed that it was instead a curse of lycanthropy, which apparently drove Bing to suicide because it convinced him that he was turning into a werewolf. Even further claiming that Bing shot himself on the night of a full moon, which for the record, he did not. She put out pamphlets against D&D about various deaths that allegedly happened on the night of full moons, including her son's death. It was absolutely not a full moon when Bing died. For Pat, you can interpret these alleged curses in one of three ways, which can be up or downplayed depending on her audience. They could be a testament to the incredible power of suggestion, planting into the mind of her impressionable son an idea that fractured his grip on reality, or it could be a mental brainwashing brought upon by Bing's evil dungeon master, which was apparently one of the teachers at his school. Or it could have been an actual literal magic curse brought upon by Satan and his legions of polyhedral dice-throwing nerds.
Did she speak to the teacher at the school who he did? I mean, did she speak to any other kids he played with or anything?
There was apparently a D&D club at his school with a bunch of kids playing after school. Whether or not he actually played that much is actually a topic of debate of whether or not he actually was that involved into D&D in the first place. There is some reason to believe that he was not that big into D&D, that he only played a couple times with them. But that being said, Pat then eventually did confront the school and the teachers over what allegedly happened. So Pat did eventually confront the school and the teachers about this, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So yeah, in any case, faced with the horrifying truth of what really unalived her son, Pulling resolved it was up to her to ensure that no parent had to face the risk of losing a child to Dungeons and Dragons ever again. And through the 1980s, she waged her war on those nasty tabletop role-playing games in terms pretty familiar to the way later moral activists tackled violent video games in the 1990s and 2000s. And check out our episodes on Jack Thompson and Dave Grossman as examples we've covered in the past. For example, in 1983, this is where we get back to that question of how she deals with a school. In 1983, she sued both TSR and Bink's school, arguing that they were responsible for the werewolf death curse that killed her son. However, these failed to gain any traction in the courts. Gosh, I wonder why. The same year, she and her husband banded together with several other family members of alleged D&D related suicide victims and formed an organization dedicated to raising awareness of the game's horrifying handiwork with the lengthy name of Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons and Other Harmful Influences on Children, usually shortened to Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, or simply BAD, in a clear homage to the advocacy group Mothers Against Drunk Driving, or MAD, which was founded in 1980. The group put out informational material warning readers against the game's negative influences and pushed for bans on tabletop role-playing at schools. They also called upon followers to contact their local, state, and federal lawmakers to take action against the game, including staging an unsuccessful campaign in 1985 to get the Federal Trade Commission to force TSR to put warning labels on all of their products. And this begins to set the stage for BAD and Pat Pulling's crusade against Dungeons and Dragons, which we'll cover in more detail next month. But before that, how we all doing?
Yeah, it's a lot. I mean, it's a tragic story. I mean, it's been kind of hinted at, like, it's a grieving mother trying to latch on to something and turning it into a crusade about how to explain why her son left her. And I mean, it's a shame D&D was it, but there's a lot of reasons it happened. Law enforcement latching on, the media latching on, movies like Mazes and Monsters, all of this played into it. And that, kind of led to this really ultimately tragic story.
Yeah, and I know there's a meme right now, like men will literally do, insert whatever thing you can think of instead of going to therapy. And I think that's actually can be true of a lot of people that, we all to some extent or other want to try to make order out of the chaos of the world. And especially if there's something as world shattering as your child taking their own life. I understand why you'd rather live in a world where there's a sensible explanation for that. And maybe it's easier in your mind to think, I can shut down a company and then they'll never make this product rather than, well, we actually need to I need to change how I parent. And also we as a society need to be better about checking in on each other's mental health. And I need to make sure I don't have a gun in my house. There's but yeah. So it is sad. And I feel for her. But again, I don't think she was channeling her grief in the most productive way.
Yeah, I don't think that she had some sort of spiteful crusade that she was on. I think that she was at sea in grief and searching for some flavor of sense out of a senseless tragedy. And it is what it is. I don't think D&D was the cause from what I can tell from the situation. But, on this show, we talk a lot about people who just seem to have a bug up their ass about video games and we can't discern why. I don't think that's the case here with her. I feel for her. It's tragic. And so I wonder where we're going to go next in this story.
You all reminded me, there was an observer, a critic of Pat Pulling in the 80s who pointed out that there's a reality where Pat Pulling became a gun control advocate and instead she went after D&D. Where like she very could have easily turned this into a firearm that was in our house, ended up being the means by which my son took their own life.
Well, it's interesting that that's also not where the police guided her, right? The police didn't ask her, why did you have guns in your house that someone had access to? Or were there guns in your house that people had access to? Did you keep the ammo separate from the guns? Were there trigger locks on the guns, etc., etc.? They asked her, were any of you Satan worshippers?
One of those is American, and one of them is not, I guess. I have really mixed feelings about Pat Pulling, having done the research on this, having seen where this goes. And it clearly started in a place where you can definitely empathize with her. No one should be in that position. Pat Pulling should have never been in that position to have to, lose her son in any circumstances, let alone the very dramatic, very tragic way she did. I think that there's some criticism you had of the way that she ended up manipulating and warping her son's death into a way to advance herself. She's a complicated figure. She's a really complicated figure in this regard, especially as we talk about the ways that she waged her war against D&D. There's a lot of things she ends up doing that are very much take of like ends justify the means kind of thing. That she was okay with like trying to, I guess, what is her end game? Is her end game to ban Dungeons and Dragons? Is her goal to eradicate TSR as a company, to eliminate the idea of role playing or whatever? Like what her end game is, and then how she thought to achieve that. Like I have a lot of feelings about Pat. Having done a lot of research on this show and seeing a lot of figures like Pat Pulling who turn to media as a thing that we need to eliminate this social problem, and that to do so we need to restrict media in some way, be it Dungeons and Dragons, be it video games, whatever. And the lengths they will attempt to do that, the logical leaps that they will take, and the kinds of things that they will accept and won't accept. So all that's to say, this is a complicated story. But you know what's not complicated? Going to check out Gathering of Gamers. Matt, where can people find your book?
Yeah, so right now, the only place to get it is through playstorypress.org, which is the publisher. You can go there, and they have links to get a print copy, an ebook, or a PDF download. The book will be available on places like Amazon and Barnes & Noble. It's just not quite there yet. So you can check out there as well. But yeah, those are the best places to find Gathering of Gamers right now.
But next time, what we will do is we'll start looking in more detail into Bad and Pat's campaign against Dungeons and Dragons, circles in which she found acceptance, but also the people who pushed back against her, and the complex debate over this question about Dungeons and Dragons and the way she waged her war against it. But until then, that will do it for today's episode of Scandalous Games. If you like what we're doing and want to help the show, subscribe or follow us wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. If you want to learn more, check out our website, scandalousgamespodcast.wordpress.com, where I publish the show notes and the sources for every episode. Our theme music is Occam Seekwe by Seek Knowledge via the Free Music Archive, used under a CC BY NC SA 3.0 US license. If you have a question, comment, or idea for a topic for a future episode, email us at scandalousgamespodcast@gmail.com. And until next time, I'm Kevin Impellizzeri.
I'm Andy Hunter.
I'm Kate.
And I'm Matt Shoemaker.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next Scandal. Subscribe to Fat Roll Gaming on YouTube and listen to So We Were Talking About Beast Wars wherever you get your podcasts.